the foramen rotundum emerges not into the orbit, but into the pterygomaxillary fissure. The two openings that pass downward are the foramen ovale for the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve, and just behind and lateral to it, the foramen spinosum for the middle meningeal artery. To see where those two come out, we'll go round to the underside. Here's the foramen ovale, just behind the lateral pterygoid plate. Here's the foramen spinosum, just behind and lateral to the foramen ovale. The last opening to look at is this untidy-looking opening, the foramen lacerum, for the internal carotid artery. In a dry skull, the appearance of the foramen lacerum is quite misleading. It appears to pass straight down through the base of the skull, emerging here at the tip of the petrous temporal bone. In the living body, the apparent opening on the underside is filled in with dense cartilage and fibrous tissue, represented by this material. Fibrous tissue also fills in this ragged part of the internal bony opening. What's left of the foramen lacerum is a clean-cut opening through which the internal carotid artery emerges from its obliquely running bony tunnel, the carotid canal. The other end of the carotid canal, as we saw in the previous section, is back here, just medial to the styloid process. In front of the opening for the carotid canal, there's one further opening that we haven't seen yet, the opening for the auditory tube, also called the eustachian tube. The auditory tube passes backwards and laterally to emerge here in the middle ear. The auditory tube is longer than this. Medially, it's prolonged by a tube of cartilage, represented by this colored material. The auditory tube opens into the nasopharynx, as we'll see. We'll look at these openings again in the sections of these two tapes that deal with the blood vessels and cranial nerves. We've seen a lot of bony anatomy in this section. Let's review what we've seen of the anatomy of the facial bones and the base of the cranium. Here's the frontal bone, the zygomatic bone, the maxilla, the sphenoid bone, and the ethmoid bone. Here's the nasal bone, the lacrimal bone, and the palatine bone. Here's the orbital cavity, the orbital margin, and the opening for the nasolacrimal duct. Here's the zygomatic arch, the temporal line, the temporal fossa, and the infratemporal fossa. Here's the pterygomaxillary fissure and the inferior orbital fissure. On the sphenoid bone, here's the lesser wing, the greater wing, and the pterygoid plates, medial and lateral. Here's the pterygoid fossa. Here's the hamulus. On the inside, here's the anterior cranial fossa, the middle cranial fossa, and the posterior cranial fossa. Here's the sphenoid ridge, the crista galli, and the cribriform plates. Here's the sella turcica, consisting of the anterior and posterior clinoid processes, the pituitary fossa, and the dorsum celli. Here's the optic canal, the superior orbital fissure, and the foramen rotundum. Here's the foramen ovale, the foramen spinosum, and the foramen lacerum. Here's the true opening of the carotid canal. Here's the opening for the auditory tube. Here's the cartilage of the auditory tube. That brings us to the end of this section on the bony anatomy of the facial skeleton and the base of the skull. In the next section, we'll move on to look at the upper part of the air passage. You'll recall that there's one important bone that we haven't yet understood, the ethmoid bone. We'll take a good look at it in the next section. In the next 3 sections, we'll look at the parts of the head and neck that are involved in 2 vital functions: breathing and eating and drinking. To get a preview of these major topics, we'll look at a specimen that's been divided in the midline. The passage for air and the passage for food and liquid begin separately at the nose and the mouth. Air passes backward through the nasal cavity and the nasopharynx. Food and liquid pass backward through the oral cavity. The 2 passages unite here. Air, food, and liquid all pass through this common passage, the oropharynx. The 2 passages separate again here in the hypopharynx. Food and liquid pass backward into the esophagus on their way to the stomach. Air passes forward through the larynx and into the trachea on its way to the lungs. So, the lines of travel for air and for food and liquid cross over in the oropharynx. It's important that air on the one hand and food and liquid on the other hand don't pass upward or downward into the wrong passage. To take care of this, there are important mobile structures above and below the oropharynx that act as separators. These are the soft palate above and the epiglottis and vocal cords below. As we'll see in later sections of this tape, the structures that form the passages for air and for food and liquid are also involved in a further important function, the production of voice sounds. In this section, we'll look at the upper part of the air passage. We'll look at the external nose, the nasal cavities, the paranasal sinuses, and the nasopharynx. We'll start by looking at the bony structures that surround these spaces. The bony opening for the nose is called the piriform aperture. Inside it, there are 2 nasal cavities, a right and a left, separated in the midline by the nasal septum. To get a better look inside, we'll divide the skull in the frontal plane along this line. There's a lot to see here. Let's get ourselves oriented. Here's the hard palate. Here's the floor of the anterior cranial fossa. Here are the medial walls of the orbits. Here are the 2 nasal cavities. The septum dividing them is a little off-center, which is not unusual. The roof of each cavity, formed by the cribriform plate, is very narrow. The medial wall of each nasal cavity, formed by the septum, is smooth and featureless. So is the floor. By contrast, the lateral wall is marked by a number of features, most notably by these 3 delicate bony projections, the conchae, also known as the turbinate bones. This is the inferior concha, this is the middle concha, this is the much smaller superior concha. The 3 conchae partially divide the air passage into 3 parts: the inferior meatus, the middle meatus, and the superior meatus. Here's the back of the orbital cavity. Below it is the hollow space in the maxilla, the maxillary antrum, which we'll look at later. At about the level of the floor of the orbit, the nasal cavity becomes much narrower. The narrowing is caused by the presence of this collection of small hollow spaces, the ethmoid air cells. We'll see more of these in a minute. To see more of the septum and the nasal cavity, we'll look at it in a skull that's been divided just to the left of the midline. Here's the bony part of the nasal septum. It's formed by this part of the ethmoid bone, the perpendicular plate, and by this small bone that we haven't encountered up till now, the vomer. The lowest part of the septum is formed by the maxilla and by the palatine bone.